Today we're going to be learning Pesachim, Daf Ayin Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Ruth Rotenberg in commemoration of the yahrzeit of her daughter, Taniel Gavria Margalit. Taniel had a unique, Aleh Shalom, had a unique innate love of Hashem, the Torah, and fellow man. We continue to hold her close and learn from her relatively short and powerful life. And by Faye Derek in honor of Tamir Feldman, Mazal Tov on your bar mitzvah, love, Saba and Safta. We're going to start with the Mishnah on Ayin Hamabet. Today, what's interesting is we're going to start with a very small aspect of roasting the Korban Pesach and a possible problem that could arise. From there, we're going to get off on two very basic machlokot. Okay, the first, it's very organized today. The first side of the daf is going to be all about one machloket, and the second side about another, and both basic machlokot in laws of kashrus. Okay, so we're leaving our topic somewhat of Pesach. We'll see how it connects back because our Mishnah, the first opinion anyway, the first machloket, we're going to have a machloket Rav and Shmuel, and then we're going to bring three questions on Shmuel's opinion, all from our Mishnah. Very basic machloket in laws of kashrut. The first one even relates also to laws of cooking on Shabbat. And the second one is going to be machloket Rav and Levi, also about laws of kashrut. Okay, so it's very interesting because if you've had enough of korbanot, today we're going to get off and into laws of kashrut. So let's start with the Mishnah at Ayin Hamabed. Naga b'charso shel tanur yiklof et mikomo. Our topic has been cooking, roasting the Korban Pesach. And the only way to do it is by roasting. And we learned roasting has to be by fire. So what if the meat touched the side of the oven? If it touched, remember their ovens were often made of cheres, of earthenware. So it touches the side. The side is obviously hot. It's going to cook the meat from the heat of the oven and not from the fire. So therefore, what do? Yiklof et mikomo. This is a very, very famous, in halachas of kashrut, we call it kedei klipa. You remove and we're going to talk about a lot today, you remove the top layer because you assume that what part of the meat did it cook? The top layer. The top layer you can't eat. That's disqualified because it's not sli esh, roasted by fire, but the rest of it you can eat. What if nataf merotvo al cheres? Okay, the reality of this case is a little bit tricky to understand, but take it at face value. If the rotev, the juice from the meat, falls onto the cheres, we're not yet sure what cheres this is. The Gemara is going to deal with it. You would assume it means, let's say, the oven. Okay, falls on the oven, on the side of the oven, on somewhere in the oven, and then what happens? So that juice, those juices get cooked by the oven itself. Again, problem, but it's not a problem because you're not eating the rotev. But then what happens? The rotev chazar elav. This is why it's a little bit hard to understand the reality. Somehow the juice came out. Maybe it splattered. I guess you could say that. When there's a big, let's say it's a lot of it and it splatters down and splatters back into the meat. So what happens? You now have juices that were cooked by the oven. Let's assume it's the oven, the cheres, the earthenware part. Then it splatters back in. It goes into the meat. It then cooks the meat. Now, in this case, what happens when juices go into the meat? They permeate a little bit more than just the meat touching the side. So in this case, yitol et mikomo, you have to take out the whole part where it is. Okay, so you have to kind of dig in a little bit, and where the juice is touched, you have to remove it. Nataf merotvo ala solet. This is another strange case. The rotev, the juices fall on some sort of pile of this wheat that they had, this solet, the very fine flour, falls on the fine flour, and then presumably goes back into the meat. Yikmotzet mikomo. Again, there's this assumption, we'll have to see why in the Gemara, that the flour heated up the sauce, and the sauce or the juices went back into the meat, cooked the meat using the heat of the solet, which is again not the heat of the fire. So you have to again take out the whole space because again, anytime it's juices, it goes further in. Now, totally different topic, although a little bit connected. Sacho b'shemen truma. Let's say you put some oil that was truma oil on top of the meat. Okay, you brushed it with oil. Im chavurat kohanim. If the whole chavura of people that are eating the Pesach are kohanim, great. It's truma. Who cares? They can eat it. Yochel. Im shel Yisrael. But if it belongs to non-kohanim, then you have an issue because there's truma in there. So what do? Im chayhu yedichenu. If it's raw, still the meat, then you can just rinse it off. We're assuming it's not going to go in there. Im tzalihu yiklof et hachitzon. If it's roasted, then you take off the top layer, okay? Sachob, it's worse. Now, again, you're going to wonder, why didn't the oil permeate? I see someone's asking about the soled, and isn't it Pesach, and what are you doing with flour? You have to remember, in those days, they made matzah on Pesach, so they did have flour around, okay? I mean, obviously, you have to worry, maybe it'll be machmitz, but they had flour around. Now there's a different issue. If you put some oil that was Maser Sheni oil, remember Maser Sheni, you bring it, it's the years number 1, 2, 4, and 5. You bring the Maser Sheni to Jerusalem, or you redeem it on a coin and bring the money, and then you buy something in Jerusalem and you eat it. So let's say you have this oil, either you brought from home or you bought it from your Maser Sheni money. So therefore, what happens? Lo yasenu damim al bnei chavura. Here's a separate issue. You're not allowed to sell parts of this right now to anyone else. Why? Because there's a law. You can't redeem Maser Sheni, the whole laws of redemption of it. You can redeem it onto a coin and flip the value. That only applies when you're at home and you want to bring it to Jerusalem. Once you get to, or you're on your way to Jerusalem, once you get to Jerusalem, you cannot do that anymore. You can't use it for any sort of business purposes or redeeming it. So therefore, when this meat now has the status of Maser Sheni in it, and therefore you can't start selling any part of it if you were going to. I mean, I don't know why you would. You're eating it for the Korban Pesach, but let's say you'd say, oh, this has my oil in it, so you have to pay me some part. Because of that, you're not allowed to do that because it's Maser Sheni. You can't do that with Maser Sheni. Now starts our machloket. Itma. It was said, this is an introduction to a machloket between two Amoraim. Cham l'toch cham. If you have something hot that mixes up, we're now in laws of kashrut. We left our topic entirely. As I said, the reason why we're here, I'll just repeat, is because we're going to see the Mishnah is going to bring 3 questions from 3 different lines in our Mishnah against Shmuel. Cham l'toch cham. If you have something hot that falls into something hot, you have hot milk that falls into hot meat. Asur, this is going to be forbidden. Why? Because we all know that when we talk about flavors mixing, it has to be hot. Okay, we'll see, maybe there's some exceptions to that we'll get to later. But in order for flavors to be absorbed, the stuff has to be hot. So if it's hot milk, hot meat, everyone agrees it's forbidden. Sonen letoch sonen divrei hakol mutar. If it's cold milk that falls on a piece of cold meat, it's fine, right? You have to rinse the meat off, but that's about it. You don't have a problem, nothing got absorbed. But cham letoch tzonein, but tzonein letoch cham. What if hot milk goes on to cold meat? Does the heat from the milk cause it to get absorbed in the meat? Or tzonein letoch cham. What if the milk was cold, but the meat was hot? So if one is hot and one is cold, does it absorb? So here comes the machloket. Rav amar ila agavar, u'Shmuel amar tata agavar. Rav says the upper one. The upper one is the one that is the stronger one. And therefore, if it's hot milk that falls into the meat, we assume that the hot milk heated up the meat. Shmuel amar tatai gaval. He says, no, it's the bottom one. Okay, the Koran has a nice footnote that describes Shmuel's logic. And remember, Shmuel was all into science and all that, and heat rises. So if the hot one is on the top, the heat's going to rise and kind of leave. So you don't really care. It's not going to do anything. If the heat's at the bottom, then it's going to basically rise up and heat up what comes on top of it. So this is a basic law, as I said, in laws of kashrut also, and also in laws of cooking on Shabbat. Why cooking on Shabbat? Because if you put, let's say, hot water into a cup of cold water, if you say tatai gavar, the bottom is what prevails, then you're going to end up with no problem. It's not going to cook that cold water. But if you say the reverse, then pouring hot water into cold water is going to cause the water to cook. So if you're Rav, you're going to say that's a problem. Now, there's all sorts of exceptions, or not exactly exceptions, but limitations. Like what if, it obviously depends on how much, what quantity you're pouring. If you're pouring a drop of hot water into a ton of cold water, or the reverse, right, that obviously might change things, okay? But the concept is, what if, again, it could be they have to be equal or close to equal for this to apply, this machloket. Anyway, there's a bunch of debates about this and how far does this reach, but it's a very, very basic machloket in laws, as I said, both in kashrut and in laws of Shabbat, of cooking on Shabbat. So here comes our 3 questions against Shmuel. The focus of this sugya is mainly Shmuel. We're going to have 3 questions against him, and then we're going to have 2 supports for what he says from a Braita. Okay, so here goes. Tnan. So it says in our Mishnah, Nataf merotvo al acheres v'chazar elav yitolet mekomo. So what did it say in our Mishnah? Again, we're going to now understand the cases a little better. The juices went onto the cheres, and then, right, which we said we assumed was the oven, but we're going to see now they don't assume it's the oven, and then went back into the meat. You told them, come on, you have to take out the whole area where the juices went into the meat. Kasal kadatach, they thought when they brought this question, becheres tzonenet, you're not talking about the cheres of the tanur. Now, what would motivate them to say that? The Mishnah started off naga becherso shel tanur. That was case number 1. We're now in case number 2. Nataf merotvo ala cheres. Now, hacheres could be the same cheres we were talking about before, the oven, which was the hot oven. But they thought maybe because it didn't say cherso shel tanur, at least I'm just guessing, therefore they assumed it must have meant just a piece, a shard that was sitting there nearby, which was then cold, wasn't hot. It's not the oven itself. So they thought that the cheres was cold. So now, let's see how Rav and Shmuel fit in. The upper one prevails. If so, mishum hachi, that makes sense then, yitolet mekomo. That's why this is a problem. Why? What's going to happen? Right? If the cheres itself is cold, what's going to happen? Now, again, the reality of this is a little hard to imagine, but azal rotev meratech lecheres. The rotev spills. You'd have to assume this was a lot of gravy, right, or juices. The juices fall onto the earthenware shard. It heats it up. It's so hot that it heats up the shard. The shard gets very hot. Then what happens? Hadar cheres meratech lerotev. Now, because the earthenware shard got hot from the juices, it now has heat. It's still touching the juices. It now heats up the juices from the heat it got from the juices themselves. And now when the juices go back into the korban pesach, come into the meat, so what happens in the end? It's the heat of the earthenware shard that heated up, that cooked the meat. And Rahman Amar, and the Torah said it has to be roasted by fire, so it can't be roasted by anything else. So that makes sense according to Rav. Obviously, Shmuel's going to have a problem if it's this cold earthenware shard. It doesn't have to be a shard, by the way. It could be a utensil. It could be anything that's cheres, earthenware. But according to him, who says it's the bottom that prevails, what's going to happen? The cheres, the earthenware, is going to get cooler, right? It's going to cool off the gravy. So why do you have to remove the spot? Okay, so it doesn't make any sense then. The gravy is only going to cool off, according to Shmuel. Okay, going back, because I see you're asking a question, Caroline, it's exactly what I said, that the reality of this is very hard to imagine, that the juice, the gravy, will heat up the earthenware piece enough to then reheat the gravy. That's why it's a little bit unrealistic. But anyway, we're going to reinterpret this source in another minute. So they say it doesn't make any sense, then it's only going to be cooler because it touched something cold. And according to Shmuel, the bottom is what determines what's going to be. So therefore, it's going to cool it down. So the answer is, just like Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Shmuel, which we're going to see in 2 minutes, on the next case in the Mishnah with the solet, that the solet, that fine flour, must have been boiling, must have been super hot flour. It must be that it's what we thought before, that it was the oven, or maybe a piece that was in the oven, it was super hot, and it fell on something hot, and not that it fell on something cold, and that then would fit in with Shmuel, because he says Tatai Gaval. And then that's going to explain it. So hachanami b'cheres roteach, we're going to say here also, the earthenware piece was hot. Okay, and that resolves it. Next case, Tana. We already know the punchline of this, because the punchline of this is going to be solet rotachat, but okay, we have to read through it anyway. Nataf merotvo la solet yichmotze mekomo. So again, they start off the exact same way. In this case, it fell on this flour, and then we say the same exact halacha. So kasal kadatach b'solet sonenet, right? They assume that they meant cooled off flour. or cool flour, cold. Bishlam al Rav. So again, according to Rav, this makes perfect sense. Again, in a perfect sense world, right? And we still don't think it makes perfect sense because reality wouldn't necessarily cause this all to happen. But again, right, as Caroline pointed out, right, that it's hard to imagine that the flour will heat up that much. That will then heat up the liquid. But we're going to assume that's what happens here. Bishlam al Rav damar Eli gaval mishum hachi yikmotzed mikomo. Why? Dimeratech le'lesolet daharda hudrane. Okay, I'll explain to you this word hudrane. It heated up the solet that went and surrounded it, encircled it. Now, what does the word hadran mean, encircle? You know, from hadran alach, go back, right? When you go back to something, you make a circle. So he's saying it gets encircled by the rotev. So the rotev heats up. Again, maybe with a really large amount of gravy, you can imagine this happening, heats up the flour. Then what happens? Again, this is the part that's harder to imagine really happening in the real world, which is hadra solet and morat chalelidide. Then that solet gets hot enough that it now heats up the gravy. And now the gravy goes back into the meat and it heats up the meat. And now the meat ends up, right? So the rotev was heated by the solet, and then they don't actually tell you this inside, but obviously then the gravy goes back into the meat, and that's why you have to take out the whole space where the gravy fell, because we can assume it went inside there. And therefore you can't use this. This doesn't make any sense, because solet kevandit sonenity ikure kame karle. This is a good sugya for Daf Yomi because it just repeats itself. So that if you didn't get the first time, you now get the second time. So he says the solet, since it's cold, it cools it down, right? It makes no sense then that you would have to then, when the juices go back into the meat, it doesn't do anything to the meat. So why would you have to take anything out? It's only cooler. So here is where Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said in the name of Shmuel that this case must be solet rotachat. Okay, it must have been that the flour was very hot, and that's how this all happened. And then that fits in with tatai gaval. The bottom is the one that prevails. Third question. Tanan, sacho b'shem and shel truma. We're still bringing questions from our Mishnah. Im chavurat kohanim yochelu, im shel Yisrael, im chayu yedichenu, im tzliu yiklaf et hachitzon. So again, what's the case? You put some oil on the meat. The oil was truma. If it's kohanim, no problem, they can eat it. If it's not kohanim, they can't eat truma. So what do? If it's raw, they rinse it off. If it's roasted, they take off the top part, just the top layer. So again, bishlam al Rav damar Eli gaval, amtu lahachi sagele beklipa. Mishum dilai tzonenu, we're assuming the meat is hot, but the oil is cold, because oil is usually cold. It's not usually heated up, although obviously you could heat up oil, but the assumption is it's cold. So what do you say? Eli gaval, the oil is cold, therefore it didn't get absorbed in. You only have to take off the top layer where the oil is physically sitting. Ela l'shmuel tamal tatai gaval tevan dechamhu mivlabala. If the meat was hot, it should have absorbed the oil, in which case the whole thing should be a problem. So amai sagele beklipa nitzar legambre. Why are you allowing just to remove the first layer? You should take, right? The whole thing should be forbidden. So the answer, shane sicha de mashu ba'alma hu davide. When you rub this with oil, how much oil do you put on the meat? Very, very little, because it's such a small amount. Therefore, we assume that this isn't a problem at all. It's so small that you just take it off. It doesn't, how much of it can get absorbed? And therefore, it's an issue of, and here you see where quantity makes a difference also. Okay, so those were three questions against Shmuel from our Mishnah. We answered them all. Now we're going to have a braita, two braitas to support Shmuel. They both kind of say the same thing. Again, it's good because it'll repeat and you'll get it for sure by the second time. Cham letoch cham asul. Okay, again, we're talking like we said before. Put something hot with something hot, you mix milk and meat, problem. Chen sonen shenatan letoch cham asul. If you put cold into hot, it will be forbidden. There you see your proof for Shmuel. Cold into hot, right? If you were Rav, you would say the top part is what determines, and it's cold, therefore they won't mix. According to Shmuel, it's the bottom, and therefore it's a problem. Cham letoch tzonen, betzonen letoch tzonen, mediach. But if you put hot into cold, right, where the cold is at the bottom, that's not a problem, or cold into cold. All you have to do is rinse it off. Okay, so there's your proof already for Shmuel, but before we move on, the Gemara has a problem with the Braita. They say, wait a minute. Cham letoch tzonen mediach. if you have something hot fall into something cold, I understand it's not going to get fully absorbed, but all you have to do is rinse it off. Since it was hot, this cold thing, this hot thing falls into something cold. While the top piece is still hot, whatever it is, whether it's liquid or it's solid, it can't possibly be that it didn't absorb something. In other words, it's true, maybe it's not going to turn the whole thing into a problem, but it definitely absorbs something, and therefore rinsing, because it does still have heat in it right now, therefore rinsing it is not sufficient. And therefore they say, klipa miani bai, at least you should have to remove the top layer and assume that a little bit absorbed into the top layer. So they say, fine, correct the Braita, and it should read, again, this doesn't have to do with Shmuel so much, right? We already proved Shmuel. But they had a problem with the Braita itself, and they say, okay, so Ema, Cham letoch tzonein kolef, tzonein letoch tzonein midiach. Those two are not exactly the same. Cold and cold, no problem, just rinse. Hot into cold, while it's true, it won't get fully absorbed, it will get a little absorbed, so you have to peel off the top layer. Okay, the same thing is going to be with this next Braita. It's basically exactly the same thing. Tanya Idach, I lost my place for a second. Tanya Idach, a different Braita. Basal roteach shenafal letoch chalav roteach. So meat, hot, right? Hot meat falls into burning, you're right. Hot meat falls into hot milk. Okay, you have milk in a pot, very hot. The meat is hot, it falls in, obviously, right? It's going to be a problem. V'chein, they don't tell you this yet, but you'll see in a minute. V'chein, sonen shenafal letoch cham. Cold meat falls into a pot of hot milk, also will be a problem. Asur. But cham letoch tzonen, v'tzonen letoch tzonen, hot into cold or cold into cold, same as the previous Braita. Mediach, all you have to do is rinse it off, to which the Gemara is going to ask the exact same question. Cham letoch tzonen mediach. Why would you rinse it off only? Since it was hot, some of it is going to be absorbed, and therefore, klipa miani bai, it should need you to remove the top layer. Okay, and therefore we say, hot into cold, you do have to peel off the top layer. Cold into cold, you don't. Someone just asked about batal b'shishim. This is obviously when you have more than shishim. Okay, if there's less than shishim, then it's not a problem because it's all nullified. Okay, but this is assuming you have more than that amount. Amar mar. Now we're going to go back into something we said, and we're going to narrow. Okay, we're going to limit a little bit what we said. Sonen letoch sonen mediach. We said cold into cold is never a problem. Well, we're going to see it's not never a problem. Amar Rav Huna lo shanu ela shalom melacho. Aval melacho asur. It's only if it wasn't salted, but if it's salted. Now, salting, we're going to say, okay, the Amar Shmuel, again, with his scientific kind of approach, he says, Maliach hareu kiroteach, kavush hareu kimevushal. When you salt something, it's like you cooked it. It goes through a process, okay? And therefore, it's like cooking, and also softens it up so that it can absorb more. And kavush hareu kimevushal, when you pickle something, right, we use vinegar and salt, it also is like as if you cooked it. So he says, therefore, tzonen letoch tzonen will be a problem, even if they weren't cooked, if there was salt there when they mixed together, or they went through a pickling process. So now, Amar Rava, Hada Amar Shmuel Maliach Hareu Kiroteach, Lo Amaran Ela Shelo Ne'achal Machmat Milcho, Aval Ne'achal Machmat Milcho Lo. This is what, if you're talking about, let's just assume we're talking about meat that, right, and you have meat that's salting, and milk falls on top of it. So what happens if the meat is salting in a large amount of salt, which usually you do when you salt meat, that you couldn't possibly eat the meat in its state with all that salt, meaning it's so much salt that you can't possibly eat that food, then it will be a problem. But if you have something like we're going to see soon, like the kuta chabavli, which has some salt in it, but you eat it, it's just like you salted your food. That's not the kind of salt that we're talking about that causes a chemical process to happen that's like cooking. Okay, so therefore, we're going to say, it's not, it's only in that case. So that's what it says. If you can eat it with the salt in it, then no, then that's not the issue. It's not going to be any different than anything else cold. So here we're going to have a case. Sahu bar gozala, there was a little young bird. It fell into a jug of kutach. Kamcha is another word for the kutach. Remember the kutach, right? And this is, I always say it's got certain elements of it. Today we're going to deal with two. Last time we talked about because it has chametz in it. But here we're going to talk about the fact that it also has milk in it and it has salt in it. So the salt, is the salt going to consider it, like Shmuel says, Maliach hareu kiroteach? It's as if you boiled it. So they say no. So the bar gozal fell into a cod of kutach. Sharya Rav Chinina bereid Rava mipashrunya. He permitted this because he said this is not a problem. Amar Rava, when Rava heard this, he said, Man chakim lemishcha milta kiha ilav Rav Chinina bereid Rava mipashrunya. He was complimenting him and saying, right, if anyone could be matir this, it would be him, to Gavar Rabbahu, because he's a great person. We keep seeing this term Gavar Rabba. Amar lecha, now why? Because he would say, this is Rava explaining why Rav Chinina was very smart that he did this. Because he only said it when you can't eat it because it's so salty. This you can eat even though it's salty. The hanimile, now we're going to have a few other limitations. Hanimile chai, it's only if it's raw. Aval tzli by klipa. Now we're going to say if the meat was already roasted, even if it's not hot, it still can absorb kedei klipa. Okay, before we said cold to cold, you just rinse. Now we're going to say if it was already roasted, what happens? The roasting softens the meat and makes it more likely to absorb. So therefore, you have to at least assume it absorbed a little bit into the first layer. You have to take off the first layer. And another one, it's only if it doesn't have ridges. If there's ridges inside, well, then it's going to get in through the ridges. And again, you're going to have a problem. Then it's going to be entirely asur because it can get all the way inside. And if it's already spiced, then again, the spices soften it and make it very likely to absorb, and therefore the meat will absorb even if it's cold. Okay, so again, what we had is this big machloket, Rav and Shmuel, about Ilai Gavar, Tatai Gavar, which one? We brought 3 questions on Shmuel from the Mishnah. We brought 2 Braitot to prove his opinion, and then we went off a little bit on the sidetrack about this issue of tzonein letoch tzonein is not a problem, and then we said, well, there are cases where tzonein letoch tzonein will be a problem, salting, pickling. And then we saw these few cases, if the meat is already softened, then it will at least absorb a little bit or possibly even more, depending on what the situation is. Now we're moving to the second machloka for today. Amarav, basar shchuta shamen. Okay, the topic now is what we call reicha, which means steam. And when you have things in an oven together, do we assume that the flavors mix? This is why you shouldn't cook milk and meat in the same oven at the same time. Okay, this is all based on this concept that reicha miltahi, which is, there's a machlok at Rav and Levi about this. Is reicha milta? Is it not? Milta means it's something, it's significant. Rav says reicha is milta, it's significant. When there's heat going on, the heat is passing things one to the other. And Levi is going to say, no, they don't. And the case they bring, it's a bit of a strange case, but not so strange. It's just a teeny bit complex. Basar, we're going to talk about, you have 2 pieces of meat. One is slaughtered, one is not slaughtered. One is a nevela, an animal that died on its own, something that would cause it to be a nevela, and one has fat on it and one doesn't. Okay, the issue here is they're going to assume the steam carries the fat from one to the other and then back to the other. Okay, so here's our case. And each one is going to bring, one's going to say it's forbidden even in an extreme case that way, and the other's going to say it's permitted even in an extreme case that way. Right? Normally we have a machloket, they're usually closer. These times they're both at extremes. Basar shchuta shamen. If you have fatty slaughtered meat, so the stuff that has the fat in it is actually kosher. Shetzlaoin basar nevela kachush. You roasted it with basar that's nevela, not kosher meat. That is very lean. It has no fat in it. Okay, we're going to assume 0 fat. Okay, I don't know how you would have such a thing that has no fat, but assume 0 fat. Asul, even so, it's going to be forbidden. My taima mifatme mehadade. One's going to fatten the other. So what happens here? This is a little bit like the rotev, okay? The juices before. The fat is going to come, they're roasted right next. Now, we're obviously not talking about, even though you might have thought that they're on top of each other. If they're on top of each other, obviously one's going into the other. But we're talking here where they're, let's say, next to each other in the same oven area. We're going to assume the fat goes out of the slaughtered meat, which is fine because it goes into the nevela meat. We don't really care because the nevela meat we're not eating anyway. But then it goes back into, and from the nevela meat, it gets swallowed up in there. And then the steam keeps going and it puts that fat back into the basar shchuta. At this point, it has the flavors from the basar nevela. So it's a problem because now that goes into the basar shchuta. is this covered or uncovered is a good question. There's a whole debate about how far we take this and how, if it's uncovered, is it allowed or not? That's a good question, okay? There's debates about that, obviously, like in most cases. So now, if you're roasting them together, he says it's all forbidden because they're mafat me'adad, the fats go back and forth. The Levi Amar, he doesn't say the words recha milta, but that's clearly what he means, okay? If they were both lean, then it wouldn't be a problem because we would assume nothing goes from one to the other. There's no fat to go. That's certainly at the premise of what he's saying. That's not what he's dealing with. Levi Amar, afilu basar shchuta kachush. Now, Levi gives the opposite extreme. He says, even if the lean meat is the kosher meat, shetzlaoim basar nevela shamen, where you only needed to go in one direction from the nevela into the shchuta, he still says it's mutar. My taima, it's just steam. Steam is nothing. What, you think steam carries the fat with it in the steam? It's just steam. It's nothing. Okay, you could see the logic for this, right? So that's their big machloket. Avid Levi uvda beresh galuta. So this has very big ramifications for cooking things in the same oven, right? For, we're going to see later today, what if you cook bread in the same oven as meat? Do you assume the bread has flavors of the meat, which means that you can't eat it with dairy. You can't put butter on your bread, okay, or things like that. So oven, and this is why some people after, right, some people will never use the same oven for milk and meat. Some people will separate 24 hours. Some people will just put up the oven for a few minutes just to get the steam out, right? And this is what it's based on, this issue of the steam. It's called recha. It's also something that's called zeah, okay, which is the steam actually. So now we're going to see some things going on about this machloket. Avid Levi uvda beresh kaluta bigdi v'davar acher. Levi had it happen once, and he allowed it. Okay, he acted upon his opinion. There was the lenient opinion where they were in the beresh kaluta. I don't know how this happened exactly, but it was a gdi cooking with a pig, and they allowed the gdi to be eaten, even though the fat could have passed through the steam. He wasn't concerned for it. Meitive. Now we have a contradiction for Levi from a braita. Ein solin shnei pesachim ke'echad. It's actually in a Tosefta of Pesachim. Ein solin shnei pesachim ke'echad mipnei ha'ta'arovet. You can't roast two Pesachs together because of mixing. Now, what is mixing? There's two options we're going to see. My lav ta'arovet ta'amim v'kashya leLevi. Doesn't this mean we're worried the flavors are going to mix in? Now, what's the issue with the flavors mixing in? Well, your Pesach belongs to me and my group. Your Pesach belongs to you and your group. If I end up with your flavors in my Pesach, then it's going to be a problem because I'm eating something that wasn't designated for me. And that's a big important halacha, as we know. So if we're assuming that the flavors are going to mix, well, that's kasha leLevi. That seems to raise a question on Levi. Why would he be worried? He says recha is not anything. So he says, oh no, you misunderstood that. Braita lo mipnei ta'arovet gufin. What are we worried about on this? Okay, we're worried that if you have two animals next to each other, you might get confused. This we talked about in the beginning. How do you keep track of whose Pesach is whose, right? It's very confusing. So you might get confused if you have two next to each other. I was thinking it's like cups in my house. So particularly with Corona, right? We're all very careful not to drink from anyone else's cups. So I put my cup, and we don't want to keep washing cups all the time. So I put my cup in one place and you put your cup in a different place. And I remember my cup's there, your cup's there, right? But let's say we put them next to each other. And I just remember mine's the one on the left and yours is the one on the right, right? Who's going to remember that, right? Half the time I go back and I'm like, oh, which one was mine? Which one was yours? It's very confusing. So if we take this example, we'll see, we're going to take it even farther in one more minute. So he says, that's the issue. We're worried that you're going to get confused whose Pesach is whose. And hachinami mistaber, this even makes more sense because look at the end of the Tosefta. Midekatani seifa afilu gdi v'taleh. Even if it's a goat and a lamb, okay? Even if they're different animals, we're still worried. What now? It must be, we're still worried I'm going to confuse them. Okay, like let's say I took a blue cup, right? In my house, we have color cups. So I took a blue cup, you took a pink cup. So I could put, right, let's say I put them next to each other. I remember mine's on the left and it's the blue one, and yours is on the right and it's the pink one. But I still might get confused is what they're saying. Even if we use different colored cups, there's still a possibility I'm going to get confused. And that only makes sense to say afilu gdi v'taleh if the concern is we're going to confuse whose is whose. Okay, so let's read that inside. That we're worried confusing the bodies of the animals. That's why it says even when they're two different animals, we're still concerned you're going to get confused, right? What's obviously the problem if we get confused? You're going to end up with my animal, and I'm going to end up with your animal, and we're going to have the wrong Korban Pesach because it has to be for the people who registered. But if we're worried that the flavors go from one to the other, well, then the words, even a gedi v'tale, even if the two animals are different, is an irrelevant factor. Mali gedi v'tale, mali gedi v'di. It doesn't make a difference if we're worried, oh, you could put them together, right? You can't put them together because we're worried the flavors might mix from one to the other. That has nothing to do with, we don't care if it's specifically a lamb and a goat that mix or a lamb and a lamb. It doesn't make a difference, or a goat and a goat. That's all the same thing. It's still mine versus yours. And that's not a factor. So the words of the Tosefta make no sense because the Tosefta says, even if it's this, and even if would make no difference. So, right, obviously you have to find the case where it would make a difference, but we still don't allow it, right? So therefore they say, even if they're two different animals, we're still worried you might confuse them. That makes perfect sense. So therefore, now we come to the other conclusion. We started with using this as a question on Levi. Now we're going to throw this back as a question on Rav, because this matches Levi perfectly. So Elamai, al korchem mipnei ta'arovet gufim udasu, aval ta'arovet ta'amim share. It sounds like we're not worried that the flavors are going to mix from one to the other. If we're not worried about that, obviously that seems to imply reicha is insignificant, right? Because the whole ta'arovet was ta'arovet gufim and not ta'arovet of flavors. So let's suggest that this creates a question on Rav. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, oh no, what's the case? Where you roasted it in two pots. Now you might be saying, what are you talking about? We didn't put the Korban Pesach in pots. Hold off, we're going to ask that right away. But first they're going to say, let me just explain the answer and then we'll explain why it doesn't make any sense. It's a good case where you read the Gemara. I always say this. Sometimes you have to read further because when I started reading this and preparing it, I said, why? How could they possibly be saying shteik deirot? There is no such thing as Korban Pesach and shteik deirot. And I sat in it for a few minutes, and then I read the next line, and then the next line is, how could you possibly say shteik deirot? So sometimes don't get too stuck in anything without moving forward, because sometimes when you move forward, you realize that they answer your question. So what's the case? You roasted it in two pots where then there's no issue. The issue of reicha is just not in the picture because they're not going to get flavors from one to the other. So to which and then Rav will say, right, the issue is you might confuse one for the other. Why are we not worried that the flavors will mix? Oh, because it's in two separate pots. So then they say, right? And then again, what's the issue? This is like the pink cup and the blue cup. You know, we have two separate cups. One's on one side of the table, one's on the other side. Right? They're near each other, but they're not exactly together. But we're still worried you might confuse them. That's the problem. We're obviously not worried flavor's going to mix because they're not near each other. Or, you know, they're close, but they're in separate pots. So now the Gemara says, but they don't cook the Korban Pesach in a pot. That would be cooking, not roasting. It means it's as if it's in two separate pots, meaning they're far enough away that the flavors are not going to mix. And hachi kamar, this is how to read it, according to Rav. Okay, you can't roast the two together because of the ta'arovet. My ta'arovet, what are we worried about? Well, we're worried about ta'arovet ta'amim. Number one, we're worried that the flavors might mix. Rav is going to say it's both ta'arovot that we're worried about. Number one, we're worried about flavors mixing. But even in a case where we're not worried about flavors mixing, we have a separate problem, which is you might confuse whose animal is whose. And that's what the afilu gdi, afilu taleh comes to relate to, the second part. So for Rav, you have to kind of add words, and that it wasn't talking about one issue. It was using one word, one term, ta'arovet, to talk about two different ta'arovot, one of flavors mixing and one of getting confused between animals, which is obviously a little bit difficult to say that one term is actually meaning two things, but that's the only way to explain it according to Rav. So we brought it at first as a question on Levi. In the end, it turns out being more difficult according to Rav. Next, Amar Rav Meri, Kitanai. Rav Meri says this machloket Rav and Levi is actually a machloket Tanaim. The Tanaim have the same debate. Harodeh pat chama. If you take hot bread out of an oven, unitanal pi chavit yain shel truma, and you put it on top of a barrel of wine. Now, what's going to happen? There's steam in the bread, and it's going to absorb flavors from the wine, and the wine is truma. It's now going to have truma in it. So Rabbi Meir osel, the Rabbi Yehuda matil. So it sounds like they're simply saying Rabbi Meir says it's forbidden because the zeah, the reicha, is something, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, we don't think that does anything. For Rabbi Yossi, he has a third opinion, which we're not going to really deal with much. Matir b'shel chitim va'oser b'shel sorim. He said it depends what kind of bread it's made out of. If it's made from barley, mipnei shasorim shoavot, it's going to be a problem because they absorb more so than wheat. So my love tonight, is it not a machloket tanaim? Demar savar recha lav miltahi. That's Rabbi Yehuda, and that's why he permits it. Umar savar recha miltahi. And Rabbi Meir forbids it because he thinks recha is milta, just like Rav. Rabbi Yehuda holds like Levi. So the Gemara says, well, not exactly. Levi vadai tanahi. The only way to take Levi says recha is not milta, so that's going to explain why Rabbi Yehuda allows it. But when he looks at the Rabbi Meir, who forbids it, the only way to explain Rabbi Meir, according to Levi, is to say he must disagree with me because there's flavors being absorbed here. So according to Levi, you'd have to say he thinks it's a machloket tanaim, and one opinion doesn't match with his. But l'Rav nema tanaihi, l'Rav nema tanaihi. But according to Rav, you don't necessarily have to say it's a machloket tanaim. Rav can read this that it all fits in with him. This is, by the way, I think I didn't say so, but I believe it's a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah in Truma. Yeah, it's a Mishnah in Masechet Truma. So Rav will say this Mishnah all holds like me. I'll explain how. Amar lecha Rav, he could say, Dekuli alma recha milti. Everyone agrees with me that recha is an issue. And how am I going to prove it? Lav itmar ala. Was it not said about that Mishnah? Dahi, on that Mishnah, Amar Rabba Bar Barchan, Amar Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish already explained this to match my opinion. Now, this is Rav. This is someone talking in the name of Rav. Everybody agrees when the bread is hot and the barrel is open, everyone agrees it's forbidden. Okay, that would be recha milta. In other words, that's not the case of the Mishnah. The Mishnah isn't like we thought originally that the bread was hot and the barrel was open. And also, by the way, if the bread was cold and the barrel was shut, what would you say? It's permitted because, of course, nothing's going. But lo nechleku, what's their machloket? Bepat chama v'chavit chatuma, or pat sonenet v'chavit ptucha. If the bread, the pot is the bread. If the bread, right? Don't confuse it with P-O-T, pot, right? If the bread was hot and the barrel was open, okay, I'm sorry, the barrel was sealed, could flavors still go even though the barrel's sealed? Or if the bread was cold and the barrel was open, could still the aroma of the wine get into the bread? Okay, that's the machloket. And therefore, hanami. Now, what did we say though? Everyone would agree though, even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that if the bread was hot and the barrel was open, it would be a problem. That shows recha milta. So hanami, our case, that Rav and Levi argue about, was like pat chaman chavit ptucha damya, and in that case, they all agree that it's a problem. So therefore, Rav could read this not as a machloket tanaim, but Levi has no way to explain the other opinion other than to say it disagrees with me. Tane Rav Kahana Bered Rav Chinin Asaba. We're now going to have three other halachot here. Pacha apa'ain tzli batanor asur lochla bekutcha. This is what I said before. If you bake bread in an oven at the same time you have roasted meat, so again, it's going to absorb from the fats of the meat, and you can't eat it with kutach because it has the flavors. This is according to Rav, obviously. Hayi benita deitve bahade bisra. If you have fish that you roasted at the same time as meat, asra Rava mi parzikia lemechla bekutcha. Rava from Parzikia said you can't eat this with kutach. Again, the same idea. This, by the way, shows people who don't eat fish and milk, right? That's all. There's a famous thing that's based on a mistake in a book, and here you have proof that it's not a problem. Right? It's only a problem if it has meat in it, but not if it doesn't have meat flavor in it. Mar bar Ashi Amar afilu. This is totally non sequitur. Mar bar Ashi Amar afilu b'milcha nami asura. Okay, even to eat it with salt, it's a problem. Mishum dekasha lerecha u davar acher. Okay, meat that's roasted with fish is bad causes bad breath, and it's also bad for leprosy. In other words, don't do this, okay, for other reasons. So we'll finish for today with the Mishnah, and tomorrow's Shiur, I got into the start from the Gemara. There's 5 korbanot that you can bring even if you're tamei or the meat becomes tamei or something. Okay, we'll get into this more in tomorrow's Shiur. Okay, I'm reminding you, if you're going to learn it on your own, print out the sheet before Shabbat. But even though you can sacrifice them betuma, you can't eat the meat from them. What are they? Ha'omer, the korban ha'omer, which was a mincha offering that you brought on the day after Pesach, the first day of Pesach. Ushte alechem, the 2 loaves that you bring on Shavuot with these 2 kivsei atzeret, with 2 animals that we're going to see in a minute. Those get eaten by the kohanim. The lechem apanim, which are the breads that get eaten by the kohanim. So again, all these can be offered, but you can't eat them if they become tamei. V'zivchei shalmei tzibur. Okay, this seems to be, although the Gemara is going to explain it otherwise, but the pshat seems to be that it's talking about the kivsei atzeret that go along with the shtei alechem. U'si'irei Rashi Chodeshim. This is Se'ir Zim L'chatat that we bring every Rosh Chodesh. And okay, so those are the 5 things that you can bring them. Even if the meat becomes tamei, you can still continue to sacrifice them, but you're not allowed to eat them. Ha-Pesach sheba b'tum'ah, one difference though between these and Pesach, Pesach ba b'tum'ah, but ne'echal b'tum'ah. You're allowed to eat it even though the meat became tamei. Why is this? Shelo ba mitchilato ela la'achila. Because it's the whole purpose of the Korban Pesach is to eat it, okay? Therefore, all these other sacrifices, the eating is secondary, right? The main thing is to sacrifice. The Korban Pesach, the whole purpose is to eat it. This shows how the Korban Pesach is inherently different, besides all sorts of other issues, right? Like, for example, we sacrifice it in the afternoon, but we eat it at night, which is also very rare, right? So all these show that Pesach has unique elements to it, and we'll leave it at that for right now. Shabbat Shalom to everybody.